Well, we'd like to welcome all of you to the Sunday class from the BYU Library Family History Center. Today we're going to be talking about taxes. It's not a very popular subject this time of year, but very helpful to genealogists and family history historians who would like to get some very specific information about their ancestors and find some that may be elusive and very difficult to find in other ways. So I'm kind of get into the process here. I like to give just kind of a brief, let's call it a example of using tax records. In my research back into the Tanner family, they live in Rhode Island when we go back far enough in time. And one of the places that we can, only places, not one of, but one of the few places we can find information going back into the 16 and so early 1700s is in the town records. And in the town records are tax records. And why are they important? Well, first of all, tax records help you identify a specific location, and taxes being an event, and a specific event in your ancestor's life. This gets you on the way to finding additional records, even though they may be even more research to do. But on the other hand, one very interesting thing that happens in those records is that whatever the periodic tax payments were due annually or whatever they were paying those taxes, the list of the taxpayers was included in the town records. And my ancestor, John Tanner, was listed as someone who was paying taxes. And he suddenly disappeared from the tax roll. Well, what happened is he moved, and he moved out of the state of Rhode Island and moved to New York. But the timing of when he moved was what the record gave us to know. In other words, we could stop looking for records for John Tanner in Rhode Island after the date he disappeared off the tax record. So that's just one example, and I'll give more as we go along through this presentation of things that'll be useful and helpful for knowing about tax records. But first, a couple of introductory things. Genealogical research focuses on finding historical documents that identify and record events in your ancestors' lives. This is kind of a definition of genealogical research and what's entailed. There's a lot said about finding your ancestors and discovering your ancestors and whatever else it is. But when we boil all that down, what we get at the end is we're looking through records, old records, finding information about our ancestors that was recorded during the time that they were alive. In fact, this is the definition. It's genealogy is location-based. That means we're looking for places first, because places were the places where the records were originally done. And the definition here is valuable genealogical records are created at or near the time and place the event occurred in your ancestors' lives and recorded by someone who witnessed the event or had a duty to report it. So in other words, what we're looking for is based upon the assumption that at the time an event like a birth, a death, a marriage, sale of property, enlistment in the army, whatever it was that happens to your ancestors, that someone had a duty or witnessed the recording of that, and we try to find the records through all of the various record sources that are scattered across the world to answer those questions. And so that's basically what we do as genealogists. Now, the problem, and I guess a little bit of a challenge that I see, is that here in the United States, people who are, let's say, doing their family history or doing genealogy often stop with some very simple records in our sense, the U.S. Census records, birth and marriage and death records. And once they do that, they feel like they've really, found out a lot about their ancestor. Well, if you look at those records carefully, you probably will have some information about who those people were. But beyond that, there's just long lists of these records that we really need to look at. And the documents that we would really like to see are our key historical documents that identify the places where the events occurred. So knowing the place is essential to finding the records because all genealogical records are cataloged, organized, whatever you wanted to call that, by location. So if you go to a large repository like our Family Search Library in Salt Lake City, then you would find the records on the shelves or in the catalogs or whatever, organized by the place. And so finding the place is very important. The other part of this and the challenge that comes is that your ancestor may have a fairly common name. And if you can attach that fairly common name to a specific location, then you have a greater chance of finding records for that person rather than having this cloud of records out there with people of the same name. And so the tax records play a really interesting role in all of this because there's the old saying, you can't avoid death or taxes. Well, since taxes are so hugely, let's call it pervasively across the whole world, that it's very inevitable that there will be records, and those records are very, very, very seldom cataloged as genealogically valuable records, in other words. So it's important to understand then from this concept, if location is so important in doing genealogical research, and tax documents can identify locations and dates and the identity of the ancestor, then that's why they're valuable records. And that's why we would spend time to learn about that particular type of record, how it was being kept, and where it was being kept, and where we might have to go to get those records. But it's kind of unfortunate from the genealogical standpoint that tax documents are not usually thought of as genealogical records. They're just not. And here's a list. This is a list of record categories for the United States of America. And the outlined part in red is that section which refers to taxation. That's it. In other words, there is hardly anything there as far as tax records would concern. And you can imagine how many tax records have been created over the years of since 1600 and 1620s and early 1600s in America and then in the United States by all these different entities. You pay city taxes, you pay county taxes, you pay state taxes, you pay federal taxes. You've got taxes on taxes, practically speaking. And so there's got to be, you just think about it, you'd think, well, there's got to be a lot of records out there that have taxes or for tax documents. And tax documents are usually government documents. That means you need to know the government organization that exists at the time where your ancestor lived or where an event occurred. So, for example, if you say, oh, my ancestor came from Massachusetts, and then he went to North Carolina, and then he ended up in Kentucky, and then he ended up in Indiana, okay, so maybe that was possible from a theoretical standpoint, but where you're going to bog down on this, if you're looking for the movement of the person, is why I started with my example, is that you're going to have to see if the person continues to be taxed in the place where they supposedly live. Okay, so you look at the Massachusetts tax records from the towns and the town records, and as you go through there, If you see where your ancestor disappears from the record, you can then make some kind of supposition that they have moved or died. And that's the other problem, is that, of course, when you die, in the United States, we have something called an estate tax. But even if that case, that's about the end of it for people who pass away. So here we are. We're out here looking for a kind of record that doesn't seem to have any particular location attached to it. In other words, where do your state tax records kept, or where are your U.S. federal tax returns kept, or things like that. Those are the kinds of things that really end up giving you an idea of what, let's call it, the real research, when you're no longer just opening a book and copying something out or copying it off, something that you found online really quickly. And you really have to start understanding the whole thing, the whole structure of it, in order to figure out where the records are and whether they're accessible, because maybe they're not accessible and maybe they are. So in this case, we need to understand also how ancient these are. Taxes existed the second they stepped on land in America. So as soon as somebody landed here, they were starting to pay taxes of some kind. And those tax records are available. You can find them. They're findable. And and one of the biggest finding to help you find those records is the Family Search Research Wiki. So if you go to familysearch.org, go to the search tab, go down to the Research Wiki, and put in the word tax, you're going to get all these different explanations of tax records. And so there's ways to get started. There's ways to use the records. And if you see here, one of the things that comes from the tax record is, generally speaking, they are organized a little bit. Well, sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But it's hopefully that they're organized. And if they're organized, what that means is that the land records are all, for real estate taxes on land, are all going to be the people 1, 2, 3, 4 next to each other. And when you see that, you obviously can then begin what we call cluster research, where we go and spread out to neighbors and friends and associates and church and stuff like that. And so basically here you have a long list of names, but if your persons showed up in this record, that would be one indication. And if there were other people in the family who showed up, or near relatives showed up, that would be perhaps a confirmation that you had the right person. So I just blew up part of this record so you could see what it looks like. And this is basically looking at a district and assessing taxes in various amounts. And these are back in, I guess we don't have a date on that one, but it's early. And one of the things you can count on is that if your ancestors owned any property, real or personal, they paid taxes. Now, here's another kind of, you have to look at it from a negative evidence kind of thing. And from a negative evidence kind of thing, it means, what if your ancestor shows up in wherever, from Georgia up to Massachusetts or Florida, up to Vermont, and just sort of appears on the record? Well, go in and look for taxes for that person. And if there are no taxes for that person, you can assume that that person didn't have any property. And if they didn't have any property, they could very well have fallen into the category of a indentured servant, or a transported person, or perhaps even a enslaved person. And so those kinds of things are wrapped up in property ownership, control, and the taxes are kind of the common element that runs through all of that and makes it possible. And so looking at tax rolls may seem like an almost impossible task, but it may be, and it may be, but someday it won't be. But it's right now, it's one of the more, let's call it, intensive parts of doing research. Now, just some of the taxes. For instance, here, beginning back, this is in 1696 tax. It was a progressive tax that because taxes with a smaller number of windows were exempt from the window tax. So it was a way of taxing bigger houses with more windows. And that would be a progressive tax because it didn't tax poor people more than the rich people. Okay. And maybe you never thought about the fact that they had a window tax. Well, if you found your person on the window tax, then in paying a window tax, then you would know that they got to a certain economic level by having a house that had enough windows to be taxed. So here's a bunch of taxes. These are from the early British colonies. And these taxes right here were crucial in the US Revolution, the Revolutionary War, because they were taxes that the colonists felt were being assessed without representation. And of course, they were unfair to the colonists, as from the viewpoint of the colonists at the time. So there was a Sugar Act, and that taxed in 1764. And you'll see these are kind of moving up to 1776. So this progressive imposition of taxes was a very big factor in the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And why were they so bad? Why were they so difficult? Well, because there were people in the United States who were trying to develop their own manufacturing and industrial businesses, and the British at that time were not encouraging that. And by taxing these various things, they were attempting to slow down development and international trade by the colonies. So you had the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. The sugar was on molasses and other goods. The Stamp Act required stamps to be put on legal documents, newspapers, and that means you had to buy the stamp to put it on the newspaper before you could sell it. And some of us are old enough to know that packages of playing cards here in the United States, the United States government decided to do the same thing after they came, they decided it was a good idea. Let's tax these things. So even up until the time when I was a lot younger, when you bought a pack of cards, they had a stamp on it that sealed it, and that stamp have been purchased from the government in a sense a tax. Some of the acts, the Townshend Acts, was a tea tax. Well, that one was the start, and the 1773 Tea Act was the flashpoint, and that's where the actual revolution and the forcible rejection of the taxes was started with the American Revolution. Now, let's think of this in terms of genealogy. In genealogy, if you get into the records of these taxes, which may in fact be in Great Britain, it could be in the British archives and not in the American archives. So you have to kind of think globally, but assuming that that was the case, there's going to be lots of records generated by these taxes. And those records are, once again, possibly genealogically valuable. So now look a little closer. We'll see the actual act. This is George III, the King of England, in 1765 passed the Stamp Act. So this is the formal document that you'll find if you start looking for some more information on these different taxes. This is my understatement of the day, and that is you may have to spend research time locating possible repositories of the tax records. Yes, when I say an understatement, I mean, yes, you may have to spend a lot of research time locating possible repositories of tax records. But if you come to me, as many people have over the past, and say, I can't find this person and I have looked everywhere. Well, everywhere usually has not included looking for tax records. And one of the things that I've mentioned just a few moments ago is that if you can't find a tax record for the person, that person, you may have the wrong person or you may have the wrong place. Because if that person was alive and doing and not an indentured servant or not an enslaved person or not transported, you probably are going to find taxes for that person, either real estate taxes or personal property taxes or some other type of tax that may have been imposed, poll taxes, all types of taxes that may have been imposed over the time periods. Basically, what I'm saying is that tax records become one of the set of records that are valuable in breaking through brick walls. They're the ones that you would look at to determine if you're simply looking for the wrong person. The person may never have existed, or they may have simply been added into somebody's genealogy from some other source. So what we find, of course, when we look critically at the entries, for instance, in the family search family tree, and go back in time, clicking back, is we find all sorts of people added on to family lines when there are no substantiating records for that person having a connection to anyone else in the line. So you have no parent-child relationship. And the interesting thing about tax records is that along when you find a tax record, then that's going to make you want to look for probate records because the person died, they would have had some estate that had to be probated. And you don't want to use your current understanding or misunderstanding of what a probate is, because back in the days of the early colonies, for example, and even later, everyone had to do probate. Everything they went through, and I've seen probate files that was no more than a saddle and maybe some cups and saucers and a pan, and that was all. But it still had to go through the courts for probate. So finding probates and tax records are about the same level of what you need to start to find. And then in addition to that, they may give you the tax record, as I've already illustrated, can begin to show how people moved and who else they were related to. This is particularly true with real estate taxes. Now, if I were going to say of all the different kinds of taxes we have here in the United States at the present time, and those that are coming up to be paid, like income taxes, for genealogical purposes, the most valuable taxes that we have and are real estate taxes. If you own a home, if you own a lot, or anything having to do with real estate, you are paying a tax. And it may be a lot of money, and it may be not so much money, and it may not even be something you think about. Or it might be something you have to plan to pay every year. And if you take that condition, in other words, that you know that on April 15th in the United States that there's going to be this issue of paying some taxes. And if you go to the real estate taxes, that may not have anything to do with April 15th. It may have to do with November or December, or September, October, whenever the state or the county imposes their real estate taxes. So you might be going through that process. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at some of these and some places where we might look. Now, one of the things that happens and why I brought up the Stamp Act in 1765 is because there is an Institute of American History called the Gilder Lehrman Institute. And basically, their focus is on the colonial taxes, their collections. So they have a few thousands and thousands of documents that are specifically talking about the taxes in the American colonies. So this is historical documents, a place where you can go search and look for the images of all of the different information about the taxes. So when you have this information and understanding, then you will have a greater chance of being able to recognize where those tax records might be and how they might be valuable in answering some particularly difficult questions. And I mentioned already, and I'll continue to mention it, that the Family Search Research Wiki is an organized place to see. So down here you'll see from 1600s to 1700s colonial Virginia source records. You'll see quit rents, which are a specific type of tax, and Virginia taxpayers, list inhabitants, internal revenue assessment lists. So along with the taxing, there were two things that needed to happen. They needed to identify the owners of the property because they were the people that had to pay the tax, and they had to identify the exact property that was occupied by the owner in order to impose the tax in a way that picked out individual owners. So from the property, they knew there was a tax due, and when they identified the owner, they knew who had to pay the tax. So those are the kinds of issues that happen. I just wanted to pull up this long sheet here that you see is the Arlington County, Virginia genealogy from the Research Wiki on Family Search. This is just a long screenshot of the beginning information that's on that one page in the Research Wiki. So if you go to the Research Wiki and you start looking at a county in Virginia, this is a list of all the information and all the records that you might be able to look through. And listed here are tax records. So this is what we have. So here's the listing on tax records. And if you know something about how the records are kept in the library, you'll recognize immediately that these are not like digital records that you're going to look at. These are actually books of records. And there's a little notation after the one in 1815 that you're looking in WorldCat, which means the worldcat.org website, where you're going to be looking up to see where this book might be located in a library. So here's what this book in 1815 is: a directory of Virginia landowners. Well, wouldn't you like to know if your ancestor was a landowner and lived in Virginia in 1815? Maybe. Trying to kind of separate out, for instance, separate out tax records from all the other records that are available is really not possible, because what we're looking at is kind of a huge mass of records. And when we focus on one kind of record, there's the implication that we have the rest of the mass out there, because tax records imply real estate records, and real estate records imply probate records, and probate records imply death records, and so forth. So these are all of the connections that come here. And I thought what I'd do is just give you a little run through. This is the Department of Real Estate Assessment's Real Property Identification Map. This is a 2024 edition. And this is kind of a place where you can begin to get information about the property that your ancestor lived. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of, I'll go through that and kind of scroll through that in just a minute. So we're going to look and see what kind of tax records might be available from Arlington County, Virginia, and directly from its website. And so here's the thing. Here's it: real estate taxes and payments and due dates. Now, how does this work? Well, land has a history in the United States and the colonies before, and we'll just say in the United States. And that is that title to the property has to be legally established. And what that also implies is that records of the previous ownership of the property are available to examine. And so if you go to sell a house, they're going to run as what's called an abstract or a title search and tell you whether, when you buy the property, if you have clear title. Now, what are they going to be looking for? Well, they'll be looking for defects in the title is what they would be looking for. And the defects in one case would be, are any taxes due on the property that remain unpaid? And if you know anything about the law in the United States, and you would know that if you fail to pay your real estate taxes for a period of time, that the county or state can come in and foreclose on your property. In other words, sell your property to pay the taxes. So all of this begins to fit together. And as it fits together, that's how when we're doing genealogical research, how we realize that all of these different kinds of records that we're working with, that we start to learn about, are related to each other. And so where your house is, if you own your home and you went through your documents that you received when you purchased your property, you would find a report from an abstract in the eastern part of the United States, an abstractor. There's what the people are called, usually an attorney. And on the western part of the United States, usually a title company, maybe title company back east also. But basically, there's two different ways of doing it in the United States, and it depends on the state and where, and their tendency for people called abstractors in the east and title companies in the west. They will have supplied you with a document ensuring your title. What that meant is they've done a search through the records and there's no encumbrances and no claims against your property. But how they did that was to go back to the original land grant or the original homestead or the original whatever it was that created the property originally and was sold from Great Britain or Spain or whoever sold the property. And once they do that and bring it forward, then they have what's called the chain of title. And why is that important? Because they're going to use the product of the chain of title to tax you. In other words, when you get your property, it's going to say, oh, you own this property. Oh, that's good because you're going to pay your taxes. How they do that now, today, is through interactive maps. And many of the states have, and counties have, very, very detailed lists of people who live in the county. Here, I'm going to show a few from here. Here where BYU is called Utah County. And the Utah County records, when you click on the map, the interactive map of the properties owned in Utah County, you get the entire chain of title. So they tell you everyone who owned that property from when it was owned by either the government or whatever, from the original way it was sold. And so here in Virginia, here's the beginning of it. They have all these maps, and they have every property mapped and identified with the owner. So the actual legal part of the map is identified. And here, another thing that's important is all the maps. And getting into them, you'll see references to Geographic Information Service data, that's GIS. And the GIS maps are interesting because that runs over to Google Earth, and you can actually use the GIS maps to give data directly into Google Earth, and you can see the land as it looks like from space and from way close. So here's kind of a run through of all the different kinds of how this works. This is this one website for Virginia, for Arlington, Virginia, and we are going through all of the different sets of maps the real estate property identification maps, to go through and identify each parcel of property. So if you think that that there's, you just have to understand that even any place almost in the United States, you can do the exact same thing. I don't know that there's some states that are still not all on counties in the United States that are still not all online, but it's still possible to go in and see all of this information from the county. That's in the case you may have to actually travel there and talk to the county. But in this case, you can go online and many other places throughout the country. So when you get done, and this is, okay, an example from Utah County, and this is Provo, Utah, where if you look down in the corner, you'll see that there's a property just to the west and south. This is the BYU campus, which isn't quite on this map. But when you pull up the property, what you can get is a parcel ID number. That gives you a specific parcel. It tells you what the value of that particular parcel is. I've blocked out the owner here. And it shows you in detail property information. So it's going to go in and show you all the information about this particular property. And these are, when you zoom in on the properties, you can see all of this is public record information. I mean, you're looking at all this and you think, well, I've seen everything about my neighbors. And the answer is yes, you have. And you can see exactly what taxes they're paying. And that parcel number up there may be the key to finding the tax records, because when they go from the county recorder who is recording this information and storing this information to the county assessor who is assessing the taxes, they use the same information and they use the maps and everything in both places. Now, one other set of records that comes up very, very frequently across the country are called cadastral records. The one that I just looked at for Arlington was online, and it was a digital copy, and it was a GIS file could be used to move into other websites like Google Earth or things like that. Now what we're talking about are paper records that were done beginning in the 1800s and into the 1900s. And these records serve exactly the same purpose as the records that they're used by the counties today. So these are let's say, before computer land records that would give you access to who owned the property and what parcels of property they owned. And so when you get into these records, you'll see that they are extremely detailed. So they show the roads, they show all of the names of all of the property owners and the outline of the property, and they have a few rivers and streams and things running through them. And why they're called cadastral records is because they're used for the purpose of imposing taxes. So they're calculating the size of these lots that the people own, and then they're paying per square foot or per meter or per rod or whatever was used as the measurement. And based on their acreage, then the tax is imposed. So are these records available? The answer to this is yes, they're available. There's a huge collection of these records in the Library of Congress. There happens to be a collection here in Utah. There's collections all over the country. And you do a search for cadastral records. This was in Iowa, Mahaska County. By the way, this Historic MapWorks is a paywall company. In other words, these maps they're free. They are, if you want a copy of the map, you're going to have to pay a fee for each copy. But there are other map record sets out there that are free. So I just put up a note that there's some of these maps may be behind a paywall and you may have to pay for the map. So how this fits together, let's suppose that I am doing research about my ancestor who lived in Iowa. And I find the person in the Iowa, one of the census, either an Iowa state census or a federal census. That tells me where the person lived. I know the town, I know the place where he lived, he, she, or the people lived. And then I am able to go to in that case, that gives me narrow it down. Now, what happens here is that once you've identified the town or the place where they lived, then you have to find the cadastral map, which I say is just another search and looking for those records and finding what's available. And once you have found the record, then you say for the town, and you'll see they had all different names for the town's things. And then it's just like zooming in and looking on the map and searching all these names to find where it is that your ancestor lived. So you have a beginning with perhaps a census record or perhaps some other kind of record that you found, and you know the town they were supposedly born in, and then to confirm that that person actually lived there the process would be to go find a tax record and see that if the person actually had to pay taxes or what was there, were they really there? And if they were really there, they're on this map. And if they weren't really there and you don't find them on this map, and you think that you should find this person, you have to, that gives you a problem because first of all, if they're not here, they didn't own any property. And if they didn't own any property, then you may either have the wrong person or you may have somebody that's going to be much harder to find. So this is kind of a place to go to look for people who are still going to be findable instead of totally ghost people that don't show up anywhere. So here's a different one. This is for Polk, Iowa, and this one came from the Library of Congress. So this one's free to look at, free to use. And so you can see here once again that there are specific names and the parcels are outlined. Now, you may wonder why all the squares and where do the squares come from? Well, that's another topic that has nothing to do with us on this particular one because we're technically talking about counties, taxes. So these are the tax maps. These are the ones that tell you which property was being taxed. And from that, you would go look for taxes and probates and all of the other documents that would be associated with the parcels of land owned. Okay, if that makes any sense at this point. So moving on to this, what we're looking for is the location. We need to find something that associates the person with a location. Once we have that, then we are basically going to have a chance at using these maps to find out their specific property, which then gives us an idea of going to other ones. And a matter of fact, you could come at this from almost the other direction. You could say, okay, so I find the person in the census record, then I find a probate record, and the probate record mentions the property. And so then you go out and look on the property tax records to see where that property was and who were the people around that property. Because when you get the people around the property, you may find additional relatives, and that would give you more information about the family. So that kind of works that way. And you're not just set out. Now, this one I'm bringing up, and the reason I'm not going to go into it in great detail is one is I'm running out of time, but that doesn't mean is the way I planned it, is because we have special presentations, we have videos from the BYU library on the Sanborn maps. These are fire insurance maps. They weren't created for the purpose of assessing taxes, but they have the same purpose as the cadastral maps to give you the exact location and ownership of a piece of property. So they go into towns primarily, and the Sanborn company, the insurance company, went in and sold fire insurance. And so, in order to calculate their risk on their insurance, they produced maps that showed all of the structures in that town. And of course, there's maps for the whole town spread out, and each map sheet fits together. So when you start looking at Sanborn maps, which are also available through the Library of Congress and other places, you will find more information that are on than are on the cadastral maps. The cadastral maps would just have kind of an ownership issue. It's the person who's going to be paying taxes that's important. On the Sanborn maps, it's the people who are going to be paying insurance premiums are the people that are important. And so they're going to show all the structures. They're going to show buildings that were created and when they were created. So, for instance, if you're doing historical research and you're doing that in conjunction with your genealogical research of an area and a town, you can see when buildings were built and when they were, what they were when they went in and became subject to fire insurance. Okay, so here's kind of the summary for finding tax records. Number one is you need to know a location of event in your ancestor's life. You have to have some place to start. It has to be a location. This is one that's interesting because normally you would say you need an exact event. You really need it. Like if I'm doing Latin American research, you can't even start to find records until you know the church where your people were baptized or married or buried. But in this case, you really can start with a state. But unfortunately, that problem is complicated because of common names. So the more focused the location, the more likely you are to find the right person. So you need to search maps, deeds, and probate files to know if there's any taxable property out there. And then you need to search for the type of taxes imposed during the life of your ancestors, such as real and personal property taxes. One of the things that is on, for instance, in the state I lived in for a long time was Arizona, and we owned a considerable amount of Arizona property. And we could see the tax history of every parcel back to when the parcel was first taxed. So you could see exactly how much money was charged against that property over time. You need to do research using maps, deeds, and probate files. And those are the things, the same thing that you have. And I say that more than once because that's the key. You just really need to use all these to get into it. And then you search for the tax information because once you know the person and you know where they were and they got their homestead or they got their bounty land or whatever it was that they got in the United States, then it's basic. Okay, now we keep learning, and that's the admonition always. So, thanks for watching. Questions?
Oh, James, one question was asked early on. Is there a handout or a syllabus?
Okay, usually when there's a request, what I do is I do a PDF of the slides so you get all the slides. And they're on our website at the library. They're posted there as handouts. They're on both websites. Okay, well, thank you so much.